It's time for Johnny and the Professor. Common sense in senseless times.
I'm an alumnus of the Department of Justice. This pattern of facts makes me angry. And it makes anyone who expects law enforcement to be nonpartisan and faithful to the law, it should make them angry as well. Now, the press has focused on your specific conclusion that you did not find evidence of political bias. I disagree with that judgment. But I think that judgment is, in many ways, the least significant component of this report. I think the facts that are in this report need to be understood, and they should be deeply chilling to anyone who understands the facts in this report. It says Steele misstated or exaggerated multiple sections of the reporting. It says that portions of it, particularly the more salacious and sexual portions, were based on, quote, rumor and speculation. It says that some of the basis of that came from conversations with, quote, friends over beers and statements that were made in, quote, jest. And the primary subsource also says to take the other subsources, quote, with a grain of salt. Now, the FBI had that information, knew that the basis of this dossier was saying it's unreliable. And what did the FBI and DOJ do? In renewal application number 2 and number 3, the FBI advised the court, quote, the FBI found the Russian-based subsource to be truthful and cooperative with zero revision.
There was an effort to affect Hillary Clinton's campaign by foreign actors. The FBI picked up that effort, they briefed her about it, and they were able to stop it. They never made any effort to brief Donald Trump about suspected problems within his campaign. Nothing about Carter Page, nothing about Papadopoulos, nothing about the other people that they thought might be working with the Russians. Why did they not tell him that?
Johnny and the Professor.
And another exciting episode of Johnny and the Professor.
Common sense for senseless times.
Where we talk politics, pop culture, and what was the P word that we're going to use today?
Today we would use pulchritude because we have two very well-educated, well-written, and extremely interesting ladies that are collectively known as the Femsplainers. Individually, they're Christina, Hoff, Sommers, and Danielle, Crittenden.
Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us. We're excited to be here. And does that make us pulchritudinous? Yeah.
Yeah, pulchritudinous. Yeah, it's a long word, but it's a great word.
I don't know. It doesn't sound so good.
But it literally means feminine grace and beauty. I mean, it's such a great word. I'm jealous.
And it doesn't sound beautiful. It sounds like accept it. Don't. Okay.
Yeah. Take the compliment and run, right?
Thank you. We are so honored.
Well, we're pleased we're finally able to get all this working together. I'm a former professor of history, as I mentioned, and I've as a matter of fact, I did articles recently on for one of our local papers on the women's movement from original suffragette on. And so that's one of the reasons definitely got me thinking about wanting to talk to you ladies. So how about get an opinion from you on the condition of feminism in America, modern feminism today?
Today, it's taken a strange turn. Danielle and I identified as feminists decades ago when it was about equality, emancipation, liberation, all these positive things, joining men and running the world. And today, it's absorbed with victimology, victim politics, grievance, and instead of aspiring to equality with men, it's almost as if it's seeking protection from them. So we have this kind of thinking couch feminism, demanding trigger warnings and safe spaces and microaggression monitoring. And I think it's a reactionary turn. So Danielle and I are standing up for equality rather than protection from, toxic males.
Well, and also for pulchritudinous.
Pulchritudinous, yes.
We think of ourselves as pulchritudinous feminists.
Well, it is interesting because I've actually in the case of Christina's I've watched your factual feminist. I myself almost have got to the point I dislike the word feminist because it's gotten almost a negative context. Now I think of myself as an equalitarian. I want everyone to be equal and have the equal opportunities.
Well, I don't like labels. I don't like isms because they imply a body of thought or belief or ideas. And I think, let's be honest, going back to the suffragettes, that when you are seeking what seems like radical change in a society, there's always going to be confrontation. And I don't want to romanticize the feminists of the 1970s who did so much, but, they were throwing down their dish towels and calling their husbands assholes and marching out. And, there's a lot of confrontation that goes on to get the successes where we are today. I agree with Christina that we're not going to be equal in the sense that we're going to be the same. I think what is disturbing to me, aside from, as Christina put it, the fainting couch feminism, this incredible anti-male stuff that's going on today, is sorry, you editing it? I briefly lost my train of thought.
That's right. I'll pick up her train of thought.
No,
okay.
There's a
Tag out quick. Okay.
Belittling men, and Danielle and I reject male chauvinism, but you don't replace it with female chauvinism.
No.
You replace it with mutuality and friendship and equality.
Right. Sorry, I knew where I was going with that. You want equality in that you have equal opportunity. That your aspirations to happiness and work and managing your lives and children. You want all of that to be recognized on an equal basis. I think what is problematic is we're both torn with defining away differences between the sexes, and yet we are also incredibly hostile towards one of the sexes. So it's a very confusing time. But we, I don't know, Christina, you and I, we like to accept that women can be different, but that we're not.
The sexes are, in this case of the sexes, we're equal but different.
And I always get worried about saying that because then people, invoke
right, separate but equal,
separate but equal. But I think it's also dangerous not to recognize that women will have different challenges from men and vice versa. And I think there is nothing more colorless and worse than a world where there are androgyny or differences between the sexes. And I think, but if we can't speak honestly and address those differences honestly, but with respect and hope, I don't know where we are. I guess we're here.
What do you ladies think that it's moved in that direction? I mean, what has been the motivation for the victimology of women? And even to the point now, I mean, the argument could go into the transgender ideas that a man who declares himself a woman is competing in sports against a woman. And in a way, that's almost, why is that different than a man just beating up on a woman? Because that's ultimately what's happening. He's using his physical advantages.
Yes, a lot of this comes from rigid ideology that went unchallenged in the academy. Basically, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but not much. The gender studies departments, there's a one-party system, and dissidents are not welcome. I know, because I was unwelcome. And I was a philosophy professor for many years. I taught feminist theory. I began to give papers and challenge some of the dogmas, and I was treated not as a critic, but as someone who'd committed a heresy, and I was excommunicated. That's no way for a person to, develop. And so I warned years ago that there was some pathology here, something very dysfunctional in a so-called academic discipline that really ruled out criticism. So what happened is that it grew, and increasingly journalists, in some cases legislators in the U.S. from both parties would sort of take seriously the pronouncements of women's studies departments. So we have a women's movement that's taken seriously, based in the academy, grounded on a lot of misinformation and toxic theories, twisted theories about a so-called patriarchy that doesn't exactly exist.
Well, it was part of the writings of the 70s that when you go back to that time, it's like what I was saying, the sort of early, the radicalism that lies at the core of any big movement is that men were written about in this very Marxist way, that they were the bourgeois, they were the overlords.
They had to be overthrown.
They had to be overthrown. Doesn't really work. It didn't work well as a political theory, and it certainly doesn't work well as a sexual theory
or in marriage.
but it's also, to be fair, what we're seeing in feminism, the women's movement today, is also what we're seeing, as Christina said, across the board in
the politicized disciplines.
Yeah, I mean,
ethnic studies and peace studies.
Right, and we have a friend, Andrew Sullivan, who actually Christina and I were having dinner with last night, and here is he's going to go down in history as one of the most, a gay rights hero. He's one of the most prominent people who brought
gay
about
marriage.
Gay marriage, and he's being written out of the gay movement now because he's a cis white male, but also he's not accepting this idea that women are men and men can be women and women can be men. We actually had him on our podcast to talk, like, that just renders, gayness in this meaningless. Like he says, I am not going to be attracted to a woman no matter how much she tells me she's a man. And he's very kind, very tolerant, very understanding, and sympathetic to those people. Right. We have to sort of think, how many people really feel like the opposite sex trapped in the other sex's body? And then you want to be obviously compassionate and say, okay, fine, if that's how you feel, that's, we must respect that. But it's gone beyond that, and it does have root in these ideologies that we cannot speak frankly or realistically or even scientifically about. Christina, were you just talking yesterday about this philosophical book that was canceled?
Yeah, at Oxford University Press.
Yeah.
Excuse me. There was a plan to publish a collection of interviews with women philosophers, but some censorious, dogmatic feminists, I won't mention names, but Kate Mann at Cornell and others found out that they were going to interview so-called, I don't like to use the word, but TERFs, trans-exclusionary radical feminists is the derogatory term, but these are actually theorists who challenge some of the... that's my dog.
A third guest today. Oh, good.
They're challenging the dogmas of the scholarship, the rigid scholarship on transgenderism. And because they're doing that, and they're doing it as gay women, they are lesbians, and they are challenging these new definitions, and they're not on board with the radical, well, they call them the trans-Taliban. They're not on board with the trans-Taliban. And for this, their book was canceled. The book was canceled because of their presence.
Which is strange
That's
because
really
it's
dogma going on in the background.
Yeah, literally dogma going on.
It adds a little color to the podcast. I'm going to go upstairs and hide.
I'm hoping you're talking about the dog, hopefully.
The dog's gone. The dog.
Okay.
Yeah.
I agree with you. It's strange because it's weird that a lot of times, and this tends to be on the one side almost entirely on this more radical idea coming from generally the left in America, I would say, that that it's all that you need to break them. You're literally taking. They want to be the group of being scientific, and yet it's an anti-science idea. I mean, if I go into a pasture and look at a bull and a cow, I can tell the difference between them. And yet, for somehow amongst human beings, there are not men and women anymore.
I know. The idea, do we have to deny that every person on the planet has a mother and a father, and as defined, biologically? There's and yet they seem to want to deny the basics of biology, and we're all supposed to go along with it. And again, I say that, and Danielle's the same, as someone I do think there are people who are genuinely trans, and there is a legitimate human rights issue here. But the details of those rights should be understood and debated, and there are different points of view. Even in the trans community, there are people with different points of view, and they are silenced if they're not on board. So that's all just goes against principle of of an open, free society.
Well, can I just throw in something else here? And yet, I hear from good friends of mine in Brooklyn that their daughter is trans, and it seems to have replaced eating disorders amongst young women.
And cutting. And it is a certain number of neurotic.
It's almost like one of these. No, I don't call it a fad, but
it's a new rebellion.
I think I think even more than rebellion, and again, to be fair and compassionate about this, that obviously there is something in the modern world that is hard and stressful for these young women, that is causing them, whether it was to develop eating disorders or start cutting themselves, and now maybe it's trans. It would be interesting to get to the source of the pathology that makes, a number of otherwise seemingly, fine young women take up these types of behaviors. But I think it is, in many of these cases, a behavior that will pass. But we're leaning into it also very heavily, where then you start to get a little nervous about when they start being diagnosed as trans and start being given hormonal therapy, or so it's a very, as with anything, unless you are able to approach it both scientifically and with intellectual honesty and debate, it gets very dangerous and disturbing. I think we were allowed to talk about anorexia and eating disorders. That was a very a medical condition that needed addressing, and medical/psychological. But this is going, it seems, beyond that, and we need to be able to address it honestly, and that's what's going on that is so upsetting, I think.
Do you ever get in conflicts with mansplainers?
We have many mansplainers on our program.
Do you rumble?
We like mansplainers.
Do you guys?
Well, we don't like the mansplainers, but there are many mansplainers who come on Femsplainers.
When is your show?
It drops weekly on Tuesdays, and it's on every major podcast platform, iTunes,
YouTube,
Ricochet, Spotify, etc.
So the communication always seems to be we've had that from other people talking about it. We had Walter E. Williams on last week on our show, and his was the same thing in the black community. And honest communication is what seems to be missing. So how do we as guys and gals come up with a way to honestly communicate in our society to deal with these issues? Because again, it sounds like we're creating almost a pathology in our relations with men and women that needs to be settled in some way.
Well, I just hope that more people will speak out and start demanding a place for moderation. And radicals always have their place in a movement, but today in the academy, the extreme is the mean, and there are no moderating influences. So we try to do that on the Femsplainers and bring in dissident voices. And we will listen to radicals, because I've learned over a lifetime that you can learn from them. Sometimes you're wrong, and they're pointing to a future that will be recognized as progress. But sometimes you have radicals who are fanatical, and they're leading to more zealotry and intimidation. And
I think what? Sorry. Yeah.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
No, I was gonna say too. What is the consequences for so many people are really, discouraging and in some cases downright scary. People who speak out, whether it's in the academy or in their office accidentally, really face a kind of censoring or canceling that affects their lives, their livelihoods. I think it's what one does about it is. So I understand why a lot more people don't just speak out against it, but I think it's important to have shows like yours, shows like ours, where we run our podcast. We're not worried about being canceled by someone. We'd have to just cancel ourselves. But
Which could happen.
we might cancel ourselves. But I think you have then, a duty in some ways to keep speaking out as much as you can to keep this conversation going. And I fear that a lot of people simply can't because of the very real repercussions against it.
Well, they find themselves in position, if you speak out against it, you're suddenly a hate speaker.
No, you lose your job. I mean, I don't mind being called a hate speaker. I mean, in the end, a lot of this is Twitter, and the world is not Twitter. A lot of people are not on Twitter, but Twitter has been very powerful in, pressuring employers to fire people or unpublish them or whatever. And I think that's a shame. I think more now than ever, especially media companies, have a duty not to cave to these mobs. And I think too often, very large companies, NBC, will cave right away without even looking into the circumstances or without looking at it as an issue of free speech or moderate speech. So I think keeping the pressure, putting an opposite kind of pressure on these organizations to stand up for people they employ is important. And same with professors, to support these people who are under siege.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I mean, I think we're probably coming upon about the time I know that Christina was getting to had a limit on it, and so I was thinking we might want to kind of wrap it up a little bit. I'm so glad we were finally able to connect up, and I'd love to do this again sometime. Though I'm
still very sorry we missed the last time. I feel terrible about that.
Well, that's okay. Well,
we were in Nashville. Yeah, we were.
Oh no! We had chaos.
No Kir Royales and sidecars for you then.
Exactly. One too many sidecars.
Well, please join us sometime on the Femsplainers.
Yeah, you could call in and mansplain. You can mansplain to us.
Well, I'll send a communication. We'll work that out sometime. We can come on as a couple of men trying to just explain why we're men. I mean, we're toxic males. Apparently, we're male and toxic. We have to be.
We're toxic males.
So how I don't. I have a term though that made my daughter mad. She said toxic male, and I said, "Is that different than a venomous feminist?"
Venomous feminist.
Well, I'm trying to think of what is the opposite of an opposite male version of pulchritudinous. I guess toxic is it. But
these days I think it's toxic is the opposite of it. Well, again, we'll go. I thank you for coming today and being on our show, and we would like to, and we'll do it again sometime.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having us. And yes, we'll get you on the mansplain.
How do we find your show
again? One more time for everybody else.
www.femsplainers.com. You'll find all our shows are there, but you can find us on iTunes, on Spotify, on TuneIn, really,
and on Twitter @Femsplainers.
Yeah, that's our social media, and on Facebook at Femsplainers, and on Instagram at Femsplainers Podcast.
Coming up on Johnny and the Professor, we'll talk about The Mandalorian. Might even throw in some Rise of Skywalker. I know Daisy Ridley's facing some heat from the interweb community. All that and more coming up on Johnny and the Professor.
You're listening to Johnny and the Professor. Politics.
This is actually what makes this whole thing so comical.
Pop culture.
This is something that they're going to be prioritizing, and that is diversity. Now, this is stupid.
Common sense in senseless times. This is Johnny and the Professor. Common sense in senseless times.
Going in front of a court of law, relying on facts that are unreliable. The number 2 was omitting Carter Page's prior relationship. Carter Page functioned as a source for a United States intelligence agency. That's a pretty darn important fact. If you're telling the FISA court, hey, the fact that this guy Carter Page, who I don't know this guy Carter Page, but the fact that he's talking to Russians, really suspicious. Well, the fact that he's serving as a source for U.S. intelligence agents is pretty darn relevant to why he's talking to Russians, because we have lots of sources that are talking to bad guys, and when you don't tell the court that, you're deceiving the court.
Contact the show at jpshowfm@gmail.com.
Well, it's Johnny and the Professor, where we talk politics, pop culture, and what was it again?
Well, if we're going to move on to our local to the politics happening in this country right now, which would be the impeachment from the House, we'd probably want to use a word like pessimism or perversion or something like that.
Oh, you're just being a Trumper. Come on.
As I said, I'm just being the word would be patriot, I guess.
You're being a Trumper. He can do no wrong in your eyes.
Trump can do wrong if you actually can prove he does wrong. The problem is that the Democrats haven't done that in this case. I mean, they put out, and for the audience, people who are living in caves and getting our broadcasts, the House of Representatives put forth 2 orders of impeachment against Donald Trump.
Quid quo pro, right? Quid quo pro, wasn't that it?
No, what they actually called it was abuse of power, and the second one was for obstruction of Congress.
Wait a minute. Abuse of power to point out that Joe Biden did some things wrong?
Well, that his son was involved in a shady deal, and were you involved in it? I mean, that's it.
If Joe Biden committed a murder since he was vice president, and Donald Trump was asking questions about that and wanted to look into it, would he get the same charges? Because, well, Joe Biden committed murder, but Donald Trump asked questions about it, so it was to influence the political election. Does that make sense? You know what I'm trying to say?
I mean, what you're saying, and it is the point, is that they've changed the parameter of it. It's like saying, everyone else does this. Everyone else asks about things. Everyone talks to politicians from one country to another, ask for favors to each other. Every deal, every trade agreement is some form of a quid pro quo, some form of a deal when you get right down to it. But they're changing the rules on it. They're saying, well, since Trump did it, it had to be for an insidious reason. It was only to bring down Joe Biden. It isn't possibly at all that maybe he just liked to know why our election got screwed with. Joe Biden was able to do this because it indicates a corruption that he was selling. He literally was withholding money to protect his son, and it goes back to the Obama administration again. And that's the big issue.
Oh, no, you can't talk bad about them.
Well, but see, Joe Biden is one. If Joe Biden did use his power to save his son from an investigation by holding back American funds.
If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Oh, son of a bitch. Got fired.
But that would be an abuse of his power.
But that's what they're accusing Trump of.
And that's what they're trying to accuse Trump of. See, and that's the weird part about it. And all Trump has done for asking the question, did this guy do anything illegal or do anything that he shouldn't have done? They're saying, well, you're trying to destroy Joe Biden. He doesn't need to destroy Joe Biden. Joe Biden is destroying himself. They say he's Donald Trump's opponent. No, he's not.
No, he's not. No.
He's not the nominee.
You're just being a Trumper.
But see, a Trumper that, if you're saying that way, what? Because I'm looking at it and saying he's not the Democratic candidate, so how is he Trump's enemy? How is he Trump's opposition? Isn't Elizabeth Warren? Then if Elizabeth Warren did something illegal and Trump asked a question about it, would he immediately be abusing his power because Elizabeth Warren say was cheating on her taxes or, claiming she was actually, an ethnic group and getting priority for it, so she could get a job at a college? I mean, that would be fraud, wouldn't it be? If he asked about that, would that mean Trump is abusing his power again? It's ridiculous. It's a no charge. The Constitution says treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. Abuse of power is, again, they're only getting it because they're trying to get bribery, and since they can't do bribery because it's not an actual, they know that has an actual definition, they're dodging it. And the other one is obstruction of Congress.
Right.
Well, I mean, Congress does that on its own, doesn't it? Isn't Congress constantly obstructing itself? And again, that's not a crime. Right. Obstruction of justice is a crime. But Congress, this is all based on the idea. I could go through and read you the part from it, but it's boring. But what they're saying is that, well, we put forth subpoenas, we want to bring in witnesses, and the Trump administration has said we're not going to cooperate with you. Well, I got news for you. That's exactly the way it is. When Hillary Clinton was being called in, she called in for investigation during the time as Secretary of State. She said no too, and they had to go to courts to see whether or not the subpoenas had to be honored. And that's the way it is. The president has power because they're the executive branch, and the legislative branch is the House and the Senate. The House of Representatives saying they're equal to the president's a damn lie. they're half as good as the president. The House and the Senate together equal the presidency.
Right.
They're only half the power level. And I think if you did a colonoscopy on Trump, you'd find that he is full of it. But that's another matter. Trump is a BSer. I have no argument about that. But to tell me, well, that's an abuse of power. You didn't follow the channels you're supposed to do. You go to a court and compel them to do it. There's no indication that Trump actually did any of this.
Right.
Okay.
Well, that one guy, he said he had an insinuation that...
You really have no testimony today that ties President Trump to a scheme to withhold aid from Ukraine in exchange for these investigations.
Other than my own presumption.
Now we know that every fantasy about how corrupt this administration was is actually true.
Other than my own presumption.
Our live coverage of the blowtorch testimony this morning.
Other than my own presumption.
From Gordon Sondland, turns out to be the guy who has offered the most stunning testimony.
Other than my own presumption.
In addition to that, and the bombshells we've heard about, this was an IED from Mr. Sondland.
Other than my own presumption.
Taking a blowtorch to every defense Donald Trump has offered.
Other than my own presumption.
Yeah, when you were looking at all the people from our foreign policy people, all the ambassadors and all these various people, all of them kept saying, "Well, I thought that was the case.
I felt that
it was exactly, and that I thought it was implied." Well, did he say it? And yet, when you got the ambassador Sondland to finally say, "Well, what did the president actually tell you?" He says directly, "I want no quid pro quo. I don't want anything. I just want
him to do what he ran on.
Ukraine to do what he ran on. Zelensky to do what he ran on." And yet, that's their order of 2 articles of impeachment.
So, you're just being a Trumper. He can do no wrong.
No, Trump does plenty of things that are questionable. I question his judgment on things here and there, but nothing that is impeachable. Yeah, Trump's got a big mouth. He sometimes puts his feet into it, But there's also something refreshing about that. I disliked Donald Trump when he was first running. I looked at him run and I went, "Boy, this guy's a jackass." I mean, is he going to be And then as time went on, I began realizing, yeah, but at least there's something refreshing about him. He's honest about it. He kind of tells it like it is. The problem with the Democrats on this, in a nutshell, is simple: that Quinnipiac, which is a polling company, and they lean to the left, they just did a poll on impeachment. It had been, a couple months ago, there was a majority of people, about 52%, thought that the president should be impeached. It's now 51% believe he shouldn't be impeached. And you can blame that directly on them having open committee hearings and having to listen to the fact that they have no case whatsoever.
I just don't like being manipulated, and to see Jeff Zucker's personal bias. Okay, you find out he has a personal vendetta against this guy, and you see it early on. It's just like this whole unfairness. That's what bothers me more than anything. So it could have been Obama, it could have been Hillary, it could have been anybody else, but that this happened to, and I would be just as vocal. It's like, okay, you have these people doing bad things to undermine a president, and that's what bothers me most. And
well, isn't that is definitely, if you think we got the 2020 election coming up, who's more guilty of manipulating the election, Zucker or the Russians?
Right.
And the answer, that's going to be easy. Zucker's going to have far more voice in it than the Russians ever would.
Right. And, they have him on tape saying push impeachment, push impeachment, push impeachment, push impeachment. You got the Democrats saying we're going to impeach him the day of his inauguration. I don't know. I don't think it's right. But I think a lot of the American people are just too stupid to do the right thing.
Well, see, the difference in you and I'm more of an optimist. You're more of a pessimist.
Right.
The fact that they're shifting in the polls, assuming the polls again, and again, this is a poll that leans left. If it says 51%, it's probably more like about 59%. In all of the swing states right now, they're conducting polls, and there's several of them on this. So, it sounds like it's the case. Like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, these are all swing states that Trump took. That he's actually beating the Democrats there now, and he wasn't doing that before. When they'd run polls against Democratic candidates, Trump would lose to them, like Biden. He was losing to Biden a month ago. Trump's beating Biden now in those states. That tells you that the American people are looking at this. The Democrats have overplayed their hand. They've said, aha, and here's our evidence, and the people going, what the hell is that? What the hell is abuse of power?
Right.
Exactly.
Who's abusing power here? And I just think people who support the Democrat Party are just still going to support the party no matter what.
That's probably true. I mean, the country, weirdly enough, the country since its inception, you can go back to the Revolutionary War, about a third were patriots, pro-American, about a third were loyalists supporting the crown, and about a third were going back and forth in the middle, couldn't figure out where they are. Now we're a third Democrats, a third Republicans, and there's a undecided in the middle that fluctuates back and forth, the moderates they like to call them. And that's where I think it's starting to hurt them. Those are the ones who are maybe a little more informed. The moderates sometimes have to read more or to get a moderate more opinion. And I think those are the ones that are going to be shifting over, and that's going to hurt them.
So, have you seen The Mandalorian?
Yes, I have. We get in on something really important. Yeah, I actually enjoyed it. I haven't really enjoyed Star Wars myself since about Empire Strikes Back and a little bit of Return of the Jedi. Mm-hmm. So I actually would watch them and going, these are pretty cool. I've always thought the Star Wars universe is interesting. The problem is they didn't really seem to know what to do with it.
Yeah, once Disney got it.
Yeah, once Disney got it. But I've been enjoying this. You got to see Jawas, and you got to having to barter with them, and apparently the little alien baby with him is...
The baby Yoda.
The baby Yoda. What's Yoda's race, but he can't be Yoda. But
right.
But yet it seems to be able to be what we consider a Force sensitive.
There's speculation that it's a clone because the guy that wanted it, not the old man that seemed like from the Empire, but the guy that... The scientist. He has a badge on his shoulder that is the same symbol of the Camino cloners from Attack of the Clones.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, there's little Easter eggs like that are pretty interesting.
I am suitably impressed. I had no idea about that.
Right.
You have dazzled me with your brilliance on this. Well, then that makes sense. It's a clone.
Well, maybe they're just saying it could be, or maybe he wants to clone it.
Again, this is taking place after the end of the Return of the Jedi,
right?
But before the new. Whatever the Abrams stuff.
And there's speculation. There's only been another creature like Yoda in, I think it was Attack of the Clones. It was a female, and you can see her. You only see her. You don't really hear from her on the Jedi Council. You'll see her sitting there, and she has this big kind of weird-looking glob of hair on top of her head. But she is the same species as Yoda, and some are speculating that is their child.
No, it could be. So I mean, her name was Yodel, I guess, right? So what did you think of in the last episode they had that I've seen was the one where they were on the primitive planet, and he encountered a rebellion shock trooper, a female character in it. I don't remember her name. I liked it myself because I had some people that online, I did read some thought they were complaining, here he comes, woman kicking the Mandalorian around and stuff. Well, she was a shock trooper of the rebellion.
Right, they're not slouches.
And the actress they cast at it, I'm drawing a blank on her name, but I know she was in Deadpool. And she was actually a real MMA fighter. She was a real MMA fighter. Right. She could probably kick both of our asses.
Right, at the same time.
Yeah. Well, we can. I'll grab her and you can hit her from behind, John.
Right.
I think we could take her together.
Right. We're toxic males anyway.
Yeah, we're toxic males. She died of her poison anyway. But I've liked her work because I liked her in Deadpool, and she is actually, like I said, I dislike when you have a woman who. This is a personal thing, and I'm in my toxicity's coming through. Right. You have a 100-pound woman throwing around 6'5", 280-pound guys. I mean, that always bugs the amount of me.
Mary Sue.
Yeah, Mary Sue. Now, if you show me a woman who's, she looks tough.
Right.
And she can fight and she can kick and she's a tough lady. So, And
she gives him a run for his money.
And she does. But you believe it. You watch the fight and you go, okay, yeah, but she's actually...
that's believable.
She picked him up at one point and slammed him down. And I go, that's because she's a lady who can... I'm sorry, you get these little, skinny,
little Daisy Ridleys.
Yeah, Daisy Ridley. Or even being cruel enough, Natasha Romanoff's. I doubt for sure she could pick a man up in plastic armor and slam him on the ground.
And actually, Daisy Ridley is facing fire from the social justice warriors because in an interview, she was talking about her and John Boyega and blah blah blah, and somehow, those social justice reporters somehow ask you the questions that nobody cares about. But she had said that she didn't feel that she's privileged, and they had a problem with that. So she's facing backlash. But then she's also voiced her displeasure with the Orange Man. So she's ticked off 63 million people or 65 million people.
Well, it's always a way to get your street cred back. If you're a lefty and you need to get your street cred back,
especially in Hollywood,
you just say Orange Man bad, and everyone goes yay. It's like living in Soviet Russia,
right?
1 in 3 people if you're in Hollywood, 1 in 3 people around you in any production area will turn you in if you say anything wrong.
Right.
I mean, which is what it was back in the Soviet Union.
What I've noticed is whatever the Democrats are caught doing, whether they're caught cheating in the election, which they were, right? The DNC.
Right.
They automatically accuse the other side, or in this case, Trump. They were caught cheating. They accuse him of cheating. They were caught kind of colluding with foreign governments, but they
went to Russia. They were getting. That's the whole report from the Steele dossier is Russian collusion.
They get caught doing that, but they accuse him of doing that. Everything that they get quid quo pro, and then they accuse everything they've been caught doing, especially the last 4 or 5 years. They automatically accuse the other side of it.
Which is why, like I said, I think you're wrong about people being terminally stupid, because that is a philosophy of the left. The left's of
projection.
The left's of the opinion that people are totally stupid and we can tell them anything and they'll believe it if we say it enough.
See, and I think there's enough Americans that are stupid enough to believe and just support that.
We'll have to see. Like I said, this is going to be the most significant election. Probably the 2020 election is going to be the most significant election, since 1860 Abraham Lincoln problem.
And how will we know it's on the up and up?
Well, that's one of the problems I'm having with this current way the Democrats are going, is that they're saying that Trump tried to affect the last election by working with the Russians, even though there's no proof of that. And the whole Mueller report said that he didn't collude with the Russians, but let's forget that, because the Democrats want to ignore that now. They're already setting up the idea that, and he'll do it again. So when we lose in 2020, we're going to scream, it's not our fault, Trump stole the election, even though they control the media, they control the education system, and they represent half of the government at least. And yet, for some reason, they're going to lose because their policies are stupid, and they think people are ignorant buffoons that they can give them anything they want. Oh, but it's not our fault. It'll ultimately be Trump's fault because Orange Man bad.
Hey, how could you say their policies are stupid?
Because
can you give me some examples?
Tell me. Well, it's much easier to try to find one that's good. It is. So what? Opening up your borders and not allowing and not regulating your borders is a good policy. That's a Democratic policy. Allowing cities to have its issues of crime and homelessness and not be dealt with because it's a violation of the homeless rights, even though they're breaking the law. Let's big things on legalizing of drugs, which of course will just create more crime. Let's not deal with Democratic policies dealing with crime because they don't exist. Think of every large city in this country that's failing and think of who's in charge of it, and you'll find out it's Democratic policies in place. Other than being in opposition to things the Republicans want, what do you want to do? You want to give Medicare to everybody? That's what the Democratic candidates are talking about. For $30 trillion later. So they don't want to. They don't want to regulate the borders. They want to give health care to illegal immigrants. They want to give health care to everybody. They don't want people to have to show ID to vote, so they don't have any idea. The citizenship idea itself is fading in the idea. So where are their policies that are beneficial to the United States of America? They want to regulate business to the point it can't do anything. They want to keep trading with China in an unrestricted manner, even though they are robbing and stealing, are the greatest political and economic threat in the world to us right now is China. But let's just cozy up with them. That's
Russia.
My only concern with Russia is it still has nuclear weapons and a large army. But economically, they're not a threat to the United States. China's a threat to the United States. China's a threat to the world.
Well, Biden, I noticed he buddied up with China, and there's a lot of them that are pals with China.
And his son's company right afterwards left with, I think, $5 billion worth of contracts when he flew over with him for a visit. Isn't that convenient? This is stuff that's going to have to come out, and I think that's going to be the interesting thing. The Inspector General's report came out, and all it basically said is that the intelligence community screwed up. That the FBI messed up on doing the FISA warrants because they were incompetent. That's one way of saying lying, but whatever.
Right.
That report, and again, inspector generals don't have the power to convene grand juries. They have very limited power. They're only looking generally at procedural issues when they do investigation. The Attorney General of the United States, of course, which is Barr, he has John Durham investigating a criminal investigation on this. He's the one that's following up on whether there was criminal activity against the Trump campaign, against people where their civil rights were violated and all that. That's going to be interesting. That'll come out next year, probably about around time. I don't know what the Democrats will be doing, 6 months from now, but Durham's report's probably going to be in about 6 months. And it'll be interesting to see what happens at that point when it comes out and find out that, gee, maybe Joe Biden did do something wrong, and gee, maybe a bunch of agents did conspire with foreign powers to violate the civil rights of people.
And I got a real problem with these reports. Like, okay, for one, they take too long, but they're interviewing people. But what's stopping people from lying to the interviewers?
The Inspector General, nothing. When you're dealing with the Durham situation, you'll be under oath, and you can lie as much as you want, but if you lie at that point and they prove you wrong, congratulations, in front of a grand jury, that's perjury. Now,
Clinton got away with it.
Clinton is the President of the United States.
Okay.
There's a high bar for removing you can't arrest a president for perjury. You'd have to impeach him, take him out of office, and then let the court arrest him for perjury. So, I mean, that isn't going to happen because it's too high of a bar. But if you're Lisa Page and you lie to Durham's people and you commit perjury, you've committed perjury, and you can go to jail for 5 to 10 years now. That's a whole other matter. And the ones that need to worry about that are James Comey and John Brennan and people like that who have lied in front of Congress, which is also a crime because you swear an oath when you do that. Mm-hmm. It's a form of perjury also. So those are the ones that are going to come back and bite them in the butt.
See, I just kind of think that the kind of like the good old boy buddy system, taking care of your own, like cops, code of silence, they're going to do this with career politicians too. And you're one of us, so we're going to
just... And there's truth in that, and that is probably the main thing that Trump's administration is bumping up against, is again the deep state. The idea it's the good old...
That's a conspiracy!
It's a whole... That is an issue that I think is what we're seeing here, and we should be... And like I said, it's something that has needed to be fixed in the United States, I think, for a long time. We've been leaning more and more on letting these bureaucrats run our country, and maybe we need to take power back from them. And who'd have thunk it would have been Donald Trump, for God's sakes, of all people. You're fired, Donald Trump, on all the different things he does. And yet he may actually be the one that has a big effect, a beneficial effect on the United States government in history in the future. What a weird idea. We live in a very strange time, a very strange world.
This has been Johnny and the Professor. Politics.
This is actually what makes this whole thing so comical.
Pop culture.
This is something that they're going to be prioritizing, and that is diversity. Now, this is stupid.
Common sense in senseless times.